Billionaire, divorced for 2 years, froze on the plane. When he saw his ex-wife with twin babies, before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The San Francisco International Airport terminal buzzed with the familiar chaos of departing travelers, but Lachlan Pierce moved through it like a man immune to disorder. At 39, his 6'3" frame commanded attention even in a crowd of business travelers. His dark charcoal Tom Ford suit was perfectly tailored, emphasizing his broad shoulders and athletic build that he maintained through disciplined morning workouts. Sandy brown hair, styled with precision, caught the terminal's fluorescent lights, while steel gray eyes scanned his boarding pass with the same intensity he applied to billion-dollar contracts. Lachlan's company, Pierce Digital Infrastructure, had revolutionized how data centers operated across 3 continents. He was the kind of man who calculated risk down to the decimal point, who never made decisions based on emotion. Every move in his life was strategic, purposeful, measured, especially the marriage he had orchestrated 4 years ago. He paused near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, his mind drifting to that October afternoon when everything changed. The media had been relentless about his playboy billionaire image, and his board of directors had grown increasingly concerned about public perception affecting their government contracts. The solution had come to him with crystalline clarity during a late-night strategy session: marriage, but not the messy, unpredictable kind that destroyed fortunes and ruined careers. A contract marriage, clean, professional, beneficial to both parties. The woman he had chosen was sitting 3 desks away from his corner office every day. Alawan Hart, his executive assistant for 2 years, 28 years old with porcelain skin that seemed to glow against her auburn hair, which she always wore in a sleek, low bun. Her emerald eyes held an intelligence that impressed him, and a sadness she tried to hide behind rimless glasses. She dressed in muted colors: charcoal blazers, navy dresses, cream blouses, always professional, never drawing attention to her naturally graceful figure. Alawan was drowning in student debt from her MBA at Stanford, working 16-hour days to afford her mother's cancer treatments. She was brilliant with logistics, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, managing his impossible schedule with quiet efficiency. But more than that, she was safe. She wouldn't expect romantic gestures or emotional declarations. She understood business. The proposal had been delivered in his office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, presented like any other contract negotiation. "I need a wife for 2 years," he had said, not looking up from his laptop screen. "The board wants stability. The media wants a story. You need financial security." Alawan had frozen in the doorway, a stack of quarterly reports in her hands. "I'm sorry, what?" "A contract marriage. 2 years. You'll receive a signing bonus of $200,000, plus a monthly allowance of $50,000. In exchange, you'll attend social functions, manage my public schedule, and maintain the appearance of a committed relationship. No emotional complications. No expectations beyond what's outlined in the agreement." He had finally looked up then, noting how her grip tightened on the reports, how her breathing became shallow, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "And after 2 years, clean divorce. You keep everything you've earned plus a completion bonus of $500,000. You'll have enough to start over anywhere you want." The silence had stretched between them for nearly a minute. Outside, San Francisco's autumn rain drummed against the windows of the 40th floor. "I need time to think," she had whispered. "Of course. Take the weekend." She had returned Monday morning with her answer: yes. Now, standing in the airport terminal, Lachlan's jaw tightened as he remembered how perfectly the arrangement had worked. Too perfectly. The media loved Alawan's grace and intelligence. His board approved of her stabilizing influence. Business partnerships flourished under his new committed family man image. But somewhere between the carefully choreographed public appearances and the private moments when they shared the same penthouse space, the lines had blurred. Not in the contract. That remained crystal clear, but in the silences during their morning coffee routine, in the way she would brush his shoulder when adjusting his tie before important meetings, in the nights when professional distance collapsed entirely, those nights when she would appear in his bedroom doorway, illuminated by the hallway light, her hair loose around her shoulders and uncertainty in her eyes, when their carefully maintained boundaries dissolved in heated whispers and desperate touches, when she would curl against him afterward, her breathing gradually slowing, and he would lie awake studying the curve of her spine, fighting the urge to say words that weren't in their contract. Words like, stay. Words like, I love you. But he never said them. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. So he perfected the art of tenderness without commitment, of passion without promises. And Elowen learned to leave his bed before dawn, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed between them, except everything had changed. For both of them, the final months of their agreement had grown increasingly strained. Elowen began working later, arriving home after he was already asleep. She stopped lingering in his study when he was reviewing contracts. The easy conversation during their public appearances became forced, mechanical. He told himself it was better this way, cleaner, more professional. But when she had approached him 3 weeks before their contract expired, requesting an immediate divorce and termination of their agreement, the ground had shifted beneath his feet. I can't do this anymore, she had said, standing in his office with the same quietly desperate composure she'd worn when accepting his proposal. I'm resigning my position effective immediately. The divorce papers are already prepared. Elowen, we agreed to 2 years. I've fulfilled my obligations. The completion bonus isn't necessary. I need to leave. He had wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to confess that the thought of her leaving felt like suffocating. Instead, he had nodded curtly and signed the papers. 3 days later, she was gone. No forwarding address, no contact information. Even her mother had moved, leaving no trace of where Elowen Hart had disappeared to. For 2 years, Lachlan had told himself he was relieved. The arrangement had served its purpose. His reputation was solid, his business stronger than ever. His life returned to its previous order and control. But late at night, in the penthouse that felt too large and too quiet, he knew he was lying to himself. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 447 to London Heathrow, the gate agent announced, pulling Lachlan from his memories. He gathered his carry-on bag, expensive leather, monogrammed, containing exactly what he needed for his 5-day business trip to London, and walked toward the gate. This was routine, first-class travel, luxury accommodations, high-stakes negotiations. This was his world, predictable and controlled. He handed his boarding pass to the agent, accepting her professional smile with a nod, and walked down the jet bridge. The plane was spacious, modern, everything designed for his comfort and efficiency. He found his seat, 1A, as always, and settled in, already mentally reviewing his presentation for tomorrow's infrastructure summit. The flight attendant offered champagne, which he declined in favor of sparkling water. He opened his laptop, preparing to use the flight time productively. Around him, other first-class passengers settled into their seats, business travelers like himself, a few families beginning luxury vacations. But as he waited for takeoff, something made him glance across the aisle. His blood froze. Elowen Hart sat 3 rows ahead, her auburn hair now falling in soft waves to her shoulders instead of the severe bun he remembered. She wore a simple cream sweater and dark jeans, casual in a way she'd never been during their marriage, but it was unmistakably her. The elegant curve of her neck, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the careful grace of her movements. And in her arms she held 2 babies, twin infants perhaps a year old with sandy brown hair that caught the cabin lights in a way that made Lachlan's heart stop completely. One baby, a boy based on his blue outfit, was sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. The other, a girl in pink, was gazing around the cabin with wide, curious eyes. Gray eyes, steel gray eyes that looked exactly like Lachlan's own. The mathematical precision that governed his life performed a calculation that shattered his world. 2 years since their divorce, plus 9 months. The timeline was perfect, devastating, absolute. Elowen must have felt his stare because she turned slightly, her emerald eyes meeting his across the cabin. For a moment that lasted forever, neither of them moved. No surprise crossed her features, only the quiet resignation of someone who had always known this moment would come eventually. Then she turned away, adjusting the sleeping boy in her arms, and Lachlan realized he couldn't breathe. His children, his son and daughter, 15 months old, according to his brutal mental arithmetic, walking, probably saying their first words, learning to explore the world. And he had missed every moment. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, but Lachlan couldn't focus on anything except the woman across the aisle who was gently bouncing one baby while the other dozed. Elowen, who had vanished from his life carrying the most precious secret in the world. As the aircraft lifted into the sky above San Francisco, carrying him toward a confrontation he'd never planned for, Lachlan Pierce, the man who calculated every risk, who controlled every variable, finally understood what it meant to have no control at all. What would you do if you discovered that the person you let slip away was carrying the future you didn't even know you wanted? The altitude stabilized at 37,000 feet, but Lachlan's world remained in free fall. He stared at his laptop screen, the same quarterly projection spreadsheet open for 20 minutes without a single number registering. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted to the seats ahead, where Elowen was quietly entertaining the twins. The little girl, his daughter, had begun to fuss, and Elowen's response was immediate and instinctive. She shifted the sleeping boy to one arm, while producing a small stuffed elephant from her carry-on bag. The girl's face lit up with pure joy, tiny hands reaching for the toy with the kind of uninhibited happiness that Lachlan had forgotten existed. Watching Elowen with their children was like witnessing a person he'd never met. Gone was the controlled professional woman who had managed his schedule with military precision. This Elowen moved with maternal grace, her voice soft as she whispered to the babies, her smile genuine in a way it had never been during their marriage. She looked free. The boy stirred, blinking awake with gray eyes that were unmistakably Pierce family genetics. Lachlan's throat constricted as he watched his son, look around with curious intelligence before settling back against his mother's shoulder with complete trust. Their names. He didn't even know their names. A flight attendant approached Elowen's seat. "Can I help with anything? Perhaps a bottle warming?" "No, thank you. They're fine for now." Elowen's voice carried the same measured politeness he remembered, but underneath was a weariness that hadn't been there before, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from raising two children alone. Alone. Because he hadn't known they existed. Lachlan's hands clenched into fists. The rage building in his chest wasn't entirely directed at Elowen, though a significant portion was. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have disappeared, knowing she was carrying his children and never said a word? But the larger portion of his anger was reserved for himself, for the man who had been so terrified of vulnerability that he'd driven away the only woman who had ever mattered, for the coward who had hidden behind contracts and control instead of admitting that somewhere between their first business meeting and their last night together, he had fallen completely, desperately, in love. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight settled into its long journey across the Atlantic. Around them, passengers began settling in for sleep or quiet entertainment. Lachlan watched Elowen check her watch, then carefully arrange pillows and blankets to create a comfortable space for the twins. Her movements were efficient, but gentle, clearly practiced. She was a good mother. Of course she was. Elowen had always been nurturing beneath her professional exterior. He remembered how she would stay late to help overwhelmed junior associates, how she'd personally coordinate care packages for employees' sick family members, how she'd quietly paid for the office janitor's son's medical bills without telling anyone. The boy, who looked so much like Lachlan it was startling, began to whimper. Elowen immediately shifted, lifting him to check his diaper before realizing he was simply hungry. She glanced around the first-class cabin, clearly calculating whether she could nurse discreetly without disturbing other passengers. Lachlan found himself half rising from his seat before catching himself. What was he going to do? Offer help? He had no idea how to care for infants. He'd never changed a diaper, never warmed a bottle, never soothed a crying baby. He was a stranger to his own children. The thought hit him like physical pain. Elowen managed to position herself so she could feed the boy while keeping the girl entertained with quiet songs. Even from his distance, Lachlan could hear her humming, a soft, melodic tune he didn't recognize. Her voice had always been beautiful, but this was different. This was the voice of a mother singing to her children, and it contained a tenderness that had never been directed at him. His phone buzzed with an incoming email, probably about tomorrow's London meetings, but he ignored it. For the first time in his professional life, business seemed completely irrelevant. How could he think about infrastructure deals and profit margins when he'd just discovered he was a father? The financial implications alone were staggering. Child support, education costs, health care, housing. Not that money was an issue, but the principle mattered. These children were entitled to everything he could provide, and Elowen had been shouldering that responsibility alone for over a year. Where was she living? How was she supporting herself and two babies? The completion bonus from their divorce would have helped, but raising twins was expensive, especially if she was on her own. On her own. The phrase echoed in his mind like an accusation. During the darkest months after their divorce, when his penthouse felt like a mausoleum, and sleep came only with the help of expensive scotch, he'd hired private investigators to find her. Not to contact her. He'd told himself he just needed to know she was safe. But Elowen Hart had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. No forwarding addresses, no employment records, no digital footprint. Either she'd changed her name or she'd become remarkably skilled at staying invisible. Now he understood why. She'd been protecting their children from a man who had proven himself incapable of emotional commitment. The girl began to cry, a soft, tired sound that immediately drew several passengers' attention. Elowen tried juggling both babies, but the logistics were clearly challenging in the confined airline seat. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and utterly alone. This time Lachlan didn't hesitate. He stood and moved toward her seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Elowen. She looked up, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. He saw fear flash across her features. Not of him exactly, but of this conversation, this moment that had been inevitable since the day she'd left. Lachlan. Her voice was steady, but her arms tightened protectively around the babies. Could I help? He gestured awkwardly toward the crying girl. I realize I have no experience, but you look like you could use an extra pair of hands. For several heartbeats, she studied his face as if trying to read his intentions. The other first-class passengers were beginning to notice the interaction, their curious glances adding pressure to an already impossible situation. Finally, Elowen nodded. Her name is Celeste. She's just tired. Celeste. His daughter's name was Celeste. The name felt like a gift and a wound simultaneously. And him? Lachlan asked, settling into the empty seat beside Elowen. Kieran. She adjusted the boy against her shoulder. He's usually the calmer one, but flying disrupts their routine. Kieran and Celeste. Beautiful names thoughtfully chosen. Names he'd had no part in selecting. Carefully, tentatively, Lachlan reached for his daughter. Celeste looked at him with wide gray eyes, so like his own that it was almost painful, before deciding he was acceptable and settling against his chest with a soft sigh. The weight of her, the warmth, the complete trust she placed in him despite being a stranger, it unmade him entirely. This small person was half of him, created from his DNA, and she was perfect in a way that made his throat close with emotion. She likes you, Elowen observed quietly, and there was something complicated in her voice. Sadness, maybe, or regret. They're beautiful, Lachlan managed, his voice rougher than intended. Absolutely beautiful. They're good babies. Curious, smart. Kieran is already trying to walk, and Celeste loves books. She'll sit and listen to stories for an hour. The casual intimacy of her words, the everyday details of their children's personalities, hit him like a physical blow. 15 months of milestones, of first smiles and first words and first steps, and he'd missed all of it. Elowen, he began, but she cut him off with a slight shake of her head. Not here, she said softly, glancing around at the other passengers. Not now. She was right, of course. This conversation was too big, too important, too explosive for a crowded airplane. But holding his daughter, feeling her tiny fingers curl around his thumb, Lachlan knew that nothing would ever be the same. The plane flew through the night toward London, carrying 3 adults whose lives had just become irrevocably intertwined, and 2 babies who had no idea their world was about to change forever. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of a red-eye flight. Most passengers were asleep, their reading lights dimmed, leaving only the soft blue glow of the emergency exit signs and the occasional flight attendant passing through with silent efficiency. But in row 3, sleep was impossible. Lachlan held Celeste against his chest, marveling at how naturally she had settled into his arms. Her tiny hand was fisted in his shirt, and her breathing had evened into the peaceful cadence of infant sleep. Every few minutes she would make a small sound, a contented sigh or a sleepy murmur, and his heart would contract with a fierceness that caught him off guard. Beside him, Elowen was gently patting Kieran's back, coaxing him toward sleep after his feeding. In the dim cabin lighting, her profile was achingly familiar yet subtly changed. The sharp angles of exhaustion had softened her features in some places, and carved deeper lines in others. Motherhood had transformed her in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking. "You're staring," she said without looking at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to understand," he replied just as quietly. "How you could disappear, how you could keep this from me." Elawan's hand stilled on Kieran's back. For a long moment, the only sounds were the airplane's engines and the soft whisper of climate control. "You really want to have this conversation now?" she asked, finally turning to look at him. In the low light, her green eyes seemed luminous, but there was steel underneath. "Here? I want to understand why my children don't know me." Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or anger. "Your children?" The words were soft but pointed. 15 minutes ago, you didn't even know they existed. Because you never told me. Because you never gave me a reason to think you'd want to know." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Lachlan felt his jaw tighten, his instinctive defensiveness rising. But Celeste shifted against his chest, making a small sound of protest at his sudden tension, and the reminder of her presence forced him to moderate his tone. "That wasn't your decision to make," he said carefully. Elawan's laugh was bitter and barely audible. "Wasn't it? Lachlan, in 4 years of working together and 2 years of marriage, you made it abundantly clear that emotions were inconvenient, that feelings were weakness. Do you honestly think I could have come to you, pregnant and terrified, and expected compassion?" The words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, because she was right, and they both knew it. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I left," she continued, her voice growing quieter as the admission cost her. "I was living in my car, eating ramen noodles for every meal, trying to figure out how to start over, and I was carrying twins from a man who had never once told me he cared about me." Living in her car. The image of Elawan, brilliant, graceful Elawan, homeless and pregnant, made his stomach lurch with shame. "You could have called." Could have what?" Her eyes flashed. "Could have come crawling back to ask for help from the man who treated our entire relationship like a business transaction. Could have given you another contract to manage, another problem to solve with money." Kieran stirred at the slight rise in her voice, and she immediately gentled her tone, resuming the soothing back pats. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she murmured to the baby. "Mama's okay." The endearment, spoken with such natural love, cut through Lachlan's defensiveness more effectively than any argument could have. This woman had spent 15 months caring for his children alone, had built a life and a bond with them that he couldn't even comprehend. "Where have you been living?" he asked quietly. Elawan hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. "Portland. I have a small apartment above a bookstore. The owner, Mrs. Chen, has been incredibly kind. She lets me bring the babies to work sometimes." "You're working in a bookstore?" The question came out more incredulous than he'd intended. "Is that beneath me?" Her tone was sharp again. "Sorry if it's not impressive enough for the ex-wife of Lachlan Pierce. That's not what I meant." He shifted Celeste more securely, noting how she instinctively curled closer to his warmth. "You have an MBA from Stanford. You could be running companies. With what childcare? What references?" Elawan's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had fought battles he couldn't imagine. "I left our marriage with nothing but what was in our agreement. No work history I could claim. Being your wife doesn't exactly translate to a resume. And finding employment that pays enough to cover childcare for twins while being flexible enough to accommodate their needs. It's not as simple as you might think." The picture she was painting was devastating. While he'd been building his empire larger, expanding to new markets and breaking profit records, the mother of his children had been struggling to afford groceries. The completion bonus went to medical bills when Kieran had pneumonia at 6 months. She said flatly, "Premature babies have complications and insurance doesn't cover everything." Premature. Another piece of information that hit him like a punch. His children had been born early, had faced health challenges, had spent time in a NICU while he was completely oblivious to their existence. "How early?" he asked, his voice rough. 34 weeks. They were in the hospital for 3 weeks. Elawan's hand moved protectively to Kieran's head. "It was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. Sitting in that NICU alone, not knowing if they were going to be okay, having no one to call or lean on. The image of her in a hospital, terrified and alone while their premature babies fought for life, nearly undid him. He had to close his eyes against the wave of self-loathing that crashed over him. "Elawan," he whispered, and the name came out like a prayer or an apology. She must have heard something in his voice because her expression softened slightly. "They're fine now, completely healthy. Kieran's actually ahead on most of his milestones, and Celeste is brilliant. She recognizes letters already. Pride. That's what he heard in her voice when she talked about their children's accomplishments. Pride and love and fierce protectiveness. Emotions he had no right to share but desperately wanted to. "What are you doing on this flight?" he asked. "Where are you going?" For the first time, Alawan looked uncertain. We're moving to London. Temporarily. Mrs. Chen has a sister who owns a small publishing house there. She offered me a position, editorial assistant with the possibility of working from home some days. It's not much, but it's a start. London. She was moving to London, the same city he was flying to for business. The coincidence seemed impossible, but then again, fate had already proven it had a twisted sense of humor. For how long? 6 months initially. Maybe longer if it works out. She studied his face carefully. Why? Before he could answer, Celeste stirred in his arms, her small face scrunching as she began to wake. Without thinking, Lachlan found himself gently bouncing her, his hand rubbing circles on her tiny back the way he'd seen Alawan do. To his amazement, it worked. Celeste settled back into sleep with a contented sigh. "She likes you," Alawan observed again, and this time there was something wistful in her voice. "She doesn't know any better," Lachlan replied, but there was no bitterness in it. Just truth. Maybe that's for the best. They're quick to love, quick to trust. It's adults who complicate things. The observation hung between them, loaded with meaning. Outside the airplane windows, stars wheeled across the Atlantic darkness, and somewhere below, the ocean carried its secrets toward distant shores. "I have meetings in London all week," Lachlan said finally. "But after that, I'd like to spend time with them, if you'll let me." Alawan was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "They're your children too. I've never wanted to keep them from you, Lachlan. I needed to protect them, and myself. From me? From disappointment. From hoping for something that might never come." The words were honest enough to cut, and accurate enough to leave him speechless. Because what could he promise her? That he'd changed. That he was ready to be the father these children deserved. He didn't even know if that was true. But holding Celeste, watching Kieran sleep peacefully against his mother's shoulder, Lachlan felt something shift inside his chest. Something that felt suspiciously like hope. The plane flew on through the night, carrying a fractured family toward an uncertain future, while questions multiplied in the darkness like stars. Heathrow Airport materialized through the morning fog like a promise and a threat. After 8 hours in the air, the cabin stirred with the restless energy of approaching arrival. Passengers stretched, gathered belongings, and prepared for the chaos of customs and baggage claim. But Lachlan felt suspended in time, reluctant to break the fragile bubble of intimacy that had formed around his makeshift family. Celeste had spent the last 2 hours of the flight alternating between his arms and Alawan's, as if testing this new person who had appeared in her small world. Each time she settled against his chest, each time her tiny fingers explored the texture of his shirt or the curve of his watch, Lachlan felt another piece of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. Kieran had been more cautious, content to observe this stranger from the safety of his mother's embrace. But when Lachlan had made faces during a particularly fussy moment, the baby had rewarded him with a gummy smile that nearly stopped his heart. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into London Heathrow," the captain announced. "Local time is 7:45 a.m., with partly cloudy skies and a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius. Alawan began the practiced routine of securing the babies for landing, checking car seats, organizing diaper bags, ensuring bottles were accessible. Her movements were efficient but tinged with exhaustion that seemed bone deep. Lachlan watched her work, noting details he'd never paid attention to during their marriage. The way she unconsciously hummed when concentrating, how she double-checked everything twice, the gentle firmness with which she handled the twins. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked as she struggled to manage both car seats while keeping the babies calm. "I've got it," she replied automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, could you hold Kieran while I get Celeste settled?" It was a small request, but it felt monumental. Lachlan accepted his son with hands that trembled slightly, still amazed by how natural it felt despite his complete lack of experience. Kieran studied his face with solemn gray eyes as if trying to solve a puzzle. "He's trying to figure you out," Alawan observed, securing Celeste's car seat with practiced efficiency. "He's the cautious one. Celeste trusts everyone immediately, but Kieran takes his time." "Smart boy," Lachlan murmured, and was rewarded with another tentative smile from his son. The plane touched down with barely a bump, and soon they were taxiing toward the gate. Around them, the first-class cabin filled with the sounds of phones powering on, conversations resuming, and the general bustle of arrival, but their small row remained cocooned in uncertain quiet. "What happens now?" Lachlan asked as the plane came to a stop. Elowen didn't meet his eyes. "We go through customs. I take the babies to our hotel to rest while I figure out the tube system. Tomorrow I start looking for permanent housing." "Your hotel?" "Nothing fancy. Just a small place in Bloomsbury that takes families." The thought of her navigating London alone with 2 babies, staying in some budget hotel, made his jaw clench. "That's not necessary." "Lachlan, I own a flat in Knightsbridge, 3 bedrooms, fully furnished. You and the children should stay there." Elowen's eyes flashed. "I'm not accepting charity." "It's not charity. It's—" He struggled for words that wouldn't sound possessive or controlling. "It's practical, safe. And it would let me spend time with Kieran and Celeste while you get settled." "While you get settled too, you mean?" "Yes," he admitted. "While I figure out how to be their father." The honesty seemed to surprise her. She studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing options and risks. Around them, passengers were beginning to deplane, but their row remained frozen in negotiation. "1 week," she said finally, "while I find something permanent, and I pay rent." "Elowen, rent, or I find my own place today?" He nodded, recognizing the steel in her voice that meant further argument was futile. "Fine. Rent." They gathered their belongings and joined the slow procession off the plane. In the jet bridge, with Celeste sleeping in her carrier and Kieran alert in his car seat, they looked like any other family arriving for a London vacation. The illusion was almost painful in its normalcy. Customs proved surprisingly smooth. Lachlan's diplomatic passport expedited the process, and Elowen's documentation was thorough and organized. Within an hour, they were standing in the arrivals hall, surrounded by the multilingual chaos of one of the world's busiest airports. "My driver should be here," Lachlan said, scanning the crowd of uniformed chauffeurs holding signs. "Driver?" Elowen raised an eyebrow. "Of course you have a driver. His name is James. He's been with me for 3 years whenever I'm in London. Very discreet, excellent with unusual situations." Before she could ask what that meant, a tall, silver-haired man in an impeccable Navy uniform approached them. James had the bearing of former military and eyes that missed nothing, but his expression remained perfectly neutral as he took in the scene. "Mr. Pierce," he said with a slight bow. "Welcome back to London. James, I'd like you to meet Elowen Hart and—" Lachlan hesitated, realizing he'd never introduced his children to anyone before. "My son and daughter, Kieran and Celeste." If James was surprised by this development, he showed no sign of it. "A pleasure, Ms. Hart. And might I say the little ones are absolutely beautiful." Elowen smiled, the first genuine smile Lachlan had seen from her since the airport. "Thank you, and please call me Elowen." "Of course. Now, shall we collect your luggage? I've brought the larger vehicle, anticipating you might have additional requirements." James's efficiency was remarkable. Within minutes, he'd secured their bags, installed the car seats with expert precision, and was guiding them through London traffic with the smooth competence that had made him invaluable to Lachlan's London operations. In the back seat, Lachlan found himself hyper-aware of every detail. The way morning light caught the auburn highlights in Elowen's hair, how she unconsciously reached to check on each baby every few minutes, the quiet contentment of his children as they watched the city pass by their windows. "First time in London?" James asked Elowen through the intercom. "Yes, though I've read about it extensively. I studied abroad in college but never made it here." "Where did you study?" Lachlan asked, realizing there were vast gaps in what he knew about her life before she'd become his assistant. "Florence, art history, and literature. I spent a summer living above a tiny bookshop near the Ponte Vecchio, helping the owner catalog her collection in exchange for room and board." The image of a younger Elowen in an Italian bookshop, surrounded by centuries-old texts and Renaissance art, was both enchanting and heartbreaking. How had he worked beside her for 4 years without knowing these essential details about who she was? "That sounds magical," he said softly. "It was. It's actually where I fell in love with rare books and publishing. Mrs. Chen reminds me of Signora Benedetti, the way she treats books like living things that deserve respect and care." Kieran began to fuss, and Elowen automatically reached into her bag for a bottle. But the motion jostled Celeste, who had been dozing, and suddenly both babies were crying in the confined space of the car. "I'm sorry," Elowen said, trying to manage both children while trapped by her seatbelt. "They're just tired and overwhelmed." "Here," Lachlan said, unbuckling his own seatbelt and shifting to help. "I've got Celeste. For the next 10 minutes, they worked together to soothe the twins, Lachlan holding and gently bouncing Celeste while Elowen fed Kieran. It was chaotic and stressful and completely natural, as if they'd been co-parenting for years instead of hours. "You're getting better at this," Elowen observed as Celeste settled into sleep against his shoulder. "Beginner's luck." "No," she said thoughtfully. "I think you're more instinctive than you realize." The compliment, small as it was, felt like absolution. They pulled up outside an elegant Georgian townhouse in Knightsbridge, its black door gleaming in the morning light. James efficiently unloaded their luggage while Lachlan fumbled with unfamiliar car seat latches, eventually succeeding in freeing a now awake and curious Kieran. "Welcome home," he said to Elowen, then caught himself. Welcome to London." But she was staring up at the building with something close to panic. "Lachlan, I can't afford this. The rent is whatever you think is fair. This building probably costs more per month than I make in a year. Then you'll pay what you can and I'll consider the rest an investment in my children's safety and comfort." Before she could protest further, the front door opened to reveal Mrs. Harrison, the building's concierge, a formidable woman in her 60s who managed Lachlan's flat with military precision. "Mr. Pierce," she said warmly, then her eyes shifted to Elowen and the babies. "And you must be our new residents. How wonderful. I've prepared the flat with everything I thought you might need for the little ones." Lachlan blinked in surprise. He'd called ahead to say he was bringing guests, but he hadn't specified. James mentioned there would be babies. "Mrs. Harrison explained with a knowing smile. "I took the liberty of arranging cribs, a high chair, some basic supplies. I hope that's acceptable." Looking at Elowen's stunned expression, at his children taking in their new surroundings with wide eyes, at this community of people who had instantly mobilized to welcome his family, Lachlan felt something shift in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, his carefully controlled world was spinning into beautiful chaos, and he was discovering he didn't want to stop it. The Knightsbridge flat was a testament to understated luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Hyde Park, cream silk wallpaper, antique furniture that whispered of old money and older taste. But as Elowen stepped inside carrying Celeste, the opulence felt more like an accusation than a welcome. Mrs. Harrison had indeed thought of everything. The spare bedroom had been transformed into a nursery with matching cribs, a changing station, and shelves lined with age-appropriate toys. The kitchen gleamed with new high chairs, bottle warmers, and enough baby supplies to stock a small store. "This is too much," Elowen whispered, setting Celeste's carrier down carefully. "It's practical," Lachlan replied, though even he seemed overwhelmed by the thoroughness of the preparations. "Mrs. Harrison is efficient." Kieran had fallen asleep during the car ride, and remained blissfully unconscious as Lachlan transferred him to one of the cribs. The sight of his son in the elegant nursery, this child who had spent his first year in a cramped Portland apartment, created a complicated knot in Lachlan's chest. "I should let you rest," he said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I have meetings starting at noon, but I could cancel." "Don't." Elowen's voice was sharp with exhaustion. "We need time to adjust, and you need time to think about whether this is really what you want." "What I want?" "Children change everything, Lachlan. Not just your schedule or your living space. Everything. Your priorities, your sleep, your freedom, your heart. And once you're in their lives, you can't take it back without devastating them." The warning hit him like a challenge. "You think I'm going to walk away? I think you've never had to put anyone else's needs before your own. And I think when you realize what that actually means, the 3 a.m. feedings, the tantrums, the way they'll need you even when it's inconvenient, you might discover this isn't the life you want." Before he could respond, Celeste woke with a sharp cry that quickly escalated to a full wail. Elowen moved immediately to soothe her, but the baby was inconsolable, her tiny face red with distress. "She's overstimulated," Elowen explained, bouncing Celeste gently. "New place, new smells, disrupted routine. This might take a while." As if summoned by his sister's cries, Kieran woke and added his voice to the chaos. Within minutes, both babies were screaming with the particular intensity that only overtired infants could achieve. Lachlan watched Elowen try to manage both children, her movements growing more frantic as nothing seemed to work. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly with fatigue. "Let me help," he said, reaching for Kieran. "You have meetings." "Forget the meetings." The next 3 hours were a masterclass in humility. Every time they managed to calm one baby, the other would start crying. Kieran rejected every bottle Lachlan offered, seeming to sense his inexperience. Celeste refused to be put down, clinging to Elowen with desperate fingers. By the time both children finally fell into exhausted sleep, Lachlan felt as though he'd run a marathon. His expensive shirt was stained with spit-up, his hair disheveled, and his usual composure completely shattered. Elowen collapsed onto the sofa, her head falling back against the cushions. "Welcome to parenting," she said with dark humor. "This was actually a good day. You should see them when they're teething." Lachlan sank down beside her, careful to maintain distance but close enough to study her profile. "How do you do this alone? You adapt. You learn to function on 2 hours of sleep. You discover reserves of patience you didn't know existed." She turned to look at him. "You also cry a lot, especially in the beginning. I'm sorry. For what? For not being there. For making you face this alone. For being too much of a coward to realize what I was losing when you left." Elowen was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "You're saying that now, while they're asleep and angelic. But Lachlan, this isn't a business deal you can optimize. It's not a problem you can solve with money or strategy. Some days they'll hate you. Some days you'll question every decision you've ever made, and you'll have to show up anyway every single day for the next 18 years. I know. Do you? Because the man I married had contingency plans for his contingency plans. He needed control, predictability, guaranteed outcomes. Children offer none of those things." Her words stung because they were accurate. But holding his children, watching them trust him despite being strangers, had awakened something in him that felt bigger than fear. "Maybe I need to learn to live without control," he said quietly. "Maybe you do." His phone buzzed insistently. His assistant, probably wondering where he was for the infrastructure summit. The meeting that had brought him to London now seemed absurdly irrelevant. "Answer it," Elowen said, noting his glance at the phone. "It's not important." "Your entire empire is built on meetings like this being important." "My empire can wait." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of hope. But before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Lachlan frowned, checking his watch. Mrs. Harrison wouldn't disturb them without calling first, and he wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent. Lachlan moved to answer it, but froze when he heard a familiar voice calling through the door. "Lachlan, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Elowen sat up straighter. "Who is that?" Lachlan's jaw clenched. "Victoria Ashworth, my former business partner." "Former? We ended our partnership 6 months ago. She also..." He hesitated, the admission awkward. "We had a brief relationship after you left. It didn't end well." The knocking became pounding, accompanied by Victoria's voice rising with frustration. "Lachlan Pierce, open this door right now or I'm calling the tabloids about your mysterious family." Elowen went pale. "She knows about the children? I don't know how she could..." "Lachlan!" Victoria's voice carried the edge of hysteria. "I saw the photos from Heathrow. You and some woman with babies. After everything you put me through, after you told me you were incapable of commitment. You have children." The babies stirred at the shouting, Kieran beginning to whimper. Elowen immediately moved to comfort him, but her eyes were wide with panic. "Make her leave," she whispered urgently. Lachlan moved toward the door, his mind racing. Victoria Ashworth was brilliant, vindictive, and well-connected. If she'd seen them at the airport, if she had photographs. "Victoria," he called through the door, keeping his voice level. "This isn't a good time." "Oh, I bet it isn't. You lying, manipulative bastard. Do you have any idea what I went through when you dropped me? The humiliation? And now I find out you've been playing happy families while I..." Her voice broke, and Lachlan realized with sinking dread that Victoria wasn't just angry. She was unhinged. Behind him, both babies were now crying, triggered by the shouting and the tension in the room. Elowen looked trapped, overwhelmed, like she wanted to grab her children and run. "I should go," she said, bouncing Kieran frantically. "Take the babies somewhere safe while you handle this." "No." The word came out fiercer than he'd intended. "You're not running because of her. Lachlan, if this woman has connections to the media, if she can hurt the children, she won't hurt anyone." He moved toward the door with grim determination. "I'll handle Victoria." But as he reached for the handle, Victoria's voice rang out with vicious clarity. "I hope they're worth it, Lachlan, because by tomorrow morning, the whole world is going to know that the great Lachlan Pierce has been hiding his secret family." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Lachlan realized their fragile peace had just shattered completely. Lachlan opened the door just wide enough to step into the hallway, pulling it shut behind him to shield his family from what was about to unfold. Victoria Ashworth stood before him like a vision from his worst nightmares. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal Armani suit, her platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, but her usually composed features twisted with rage and something darker. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful. Flawless, polished, and utterly cold. Utterly. At 35, Victoria had built her own tech empire through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless ambition. She was also the only woman who had ever made Lachlan feel like he was the one being hunted rather than the hunter. Victoria. His voice carried all the authority of a man accustomed to controlling boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. How did you find me? Really? Her laugh was sharp as broken glass. You think you can just disappear with your secret family and I wouldn't notice? I have contacts at every major airport in Europe, Lachlan. Did you honestly think you could waltz through Heathrow with a woman and 2 babies without someone recognizing you? Behind the door he could hear the muffled sounds of crying babies and Elowen's gentle voice trying to soothe them. The contrast between that domestic warmth and Victoria's frigid fury was stark enough to make his chest ache. What do you want? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Victoria stepped closer and he caught the familiar scent of her perfume. Chanel No. 5, expensive and suffocating. What do I want? I want an explanation. I want to know why you told me you were constitutionally incapable of love, why you said commitment was a weakness you couldn't afford, when apparently you've been playing daddy all along. It's not what you think, isn't it? She pulled out her phone, swiping through photos with vicious satisfaction, because these pictures tell quite a story. You, looking absolutely besotted with some auburn-haired woman. You, holding a baby like you've done it 1,000 times before. You, playing the devoted family man you swore you'd never be. The photos were damning in their intimacy. Shots of him carrying Celeste through the airport, of his hand protectively on Elowen's back as they navigated customs, of his face transformed by an expression Victoria had never seen in all their months together. Tenderness. Where did you get these? Does it matter? What matters is that I trusted you. I believed you when you said you weren't capable of more than what we had. I accepted your limitations, your boundaries, your cold little arrangement because I thought that was just who you were. Her voice cracked slightly. But it wasn't, was it? You were perfectly capable of love. You just weren't capable of loving me. The accusation hit closer to home than he cared to admit. His relationship with Victoria had been convenient, mutually beneficial, and ultimately hollow. She'd been brilliant and beautiful and everything that should have been perfect for a man like him. But she'd never been Elowen. Victoria, what we had was what? A mistake? A placeholder? God, I feel like such a fool. She laughed bitterly. Do you know what I've been through these past 6 months? The humiliation of being dropped by the great Lachlan Pierce? The whispers in boardrooms about what I must have done wrong to lose you? I never meant for you to be humiliated. No, you just meant for me to be convenient. Available when you needed a +1. Absent when you didn't want complications. Just like you did with her, I'm guessing. Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. Because that's your pattern, isn't it? Keep women at arm's length, use them for what you need, then discard them when they become inconvenient. You don't know anything about Elowen. Elowen. Victoria repeated the name like it tasted bitter. Pretty name. Very ethereal. And those babies. They're yours, aren't they? I can see it in your face, in the way you held them. When did this happen? Was she pregnant when you were still with me? No. The word came out sharp as a blade. Elowen and I, it's complicated. Oh, I'm sure it is, but here's what's not complicated. Those photos, the story they tell, and the fact that by morning, every tabloid in London is going to have them. Lachlan felt ice settle in his veins. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Victoria's smile was predatory. You have no idea what I'm capable of when I've been betrayed, Lachlan. You think you know me because we shared a bed for 6 months? You don't know me at all. The door behind him opened slightly, and Elowen appeared in the gap, Kieran in her arms and exhaustion written across her features. Lachlan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Celeste won't stop crying and I think she's running a fever. Victoria's eyes zeroed in on Elowen with laser focus, taking in every detail. The natural beauty that needed no enhancement, the maternal grace, the way she looked at Lachlan with a combination of trust and wariness that spoke of complicated history. So you're the famous Elowen, Victoria said with false sweetness. The woman who managed to accomplish what no one else could. turning the ice-cold Lachlan Pierce into a devoted father. Elowen's arm tightened protectively around Kieran. I'm sorry. I don't believe we've been introduced. Victoria Ashworth, Lachlan's former business partner. The pause was deliberate and loaded with implication. Current crisis, Lachlan interjected firmly. Elowen, go back inside. I'll be there in a moment. But Victoria wasn't finished. Tell me, Elowen, how long have you known Lachlan? Because I'm trying to figure out the timeline here. When exactly did he become this wonderful family man you seem to think he is? Victoria, enough. Lachlan's voice carried a warning that would have silenced most people. Victoria ignored him completely. Because the man I knew was incapable of genuine emotion. Charming, yes. Passionate, absolutely. But love? Commitment? The kind of devotion that creates families? She laughed cruelly. That man didn't exist. So either you've performed some kind of miracle, or you're about to learn some very painful truths about the father of your children. Elowen went very still, and Lachlan could see the fear creeping into her eyes. Not fear of Victoria, but fear that these venomous words might contain some element of truth. What does she mean? Elowen asked quietly. She means nothing. She's angry and trying to cause trouble. Am I? Victoria pulled out her phone again. Because I have 6 months of messages here, Elowen. Messages where Lachlan explained in great detail why he could never be what I wanted, why emotional attachments were weakness, why he had no interest in children or family, or any of the things normal people value. Show her, Victoria continued, scrolling through her phone. Show her the text where you said, and I quote, "Love is a luxury I can't afford and a risk I won't take." Or this one, "Children represent chaos and unpredictability, everything I've spent my life avoiding." Each quoted message hit Elowen like a physical blow. Lachlan watched the color drain from her face, watched her hold Kieran closer, as if shielding him from the poison Victoria was spilling. Those messages were what? Lies? Jokes? Victoria's voice rose. Because they seemed pretty sincere when you were explaining why you were ending our relationship, when you were telling me that I was asking for something you were constitutionally incapable of giving. Kieran began to cry, sensing his mother's distress, and from inside the flat came the sound of Celeste's escalating wails. Elowen looked overwhelmed, trapped between the chaos inside and the venom outside. I have to go, she whispered, backing toward the door. The babies need... Of course, Victoria said with false sympathy. Run along and take care of your children. But Elowen, you might want to ask yourself what changed Lachlan's mind about family, because in my experience, men like him don't change. They just get better at pretending. The door closed behind Elowen with a soft click that sounded like judgment. Lachlan was left alone in the hallway with Victoria and the wreckage of words that couldn't be taken back. Satisfied? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. Not even close. Victoria's smile was sharp as winter. I want you to suffer the way I did. I want you to lose everything that matters to you the way you took everything that mattered to me. I never promised you anything. No. But you promised her something, didn't you? Otherwise, why would she be here? Why would she trust you with those babies? Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. What happens when she realizes that the devoted father act is just that? An act? What happens when you revert to type and destroy another woman who was foolish enough to believe in you? You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to break that poor woman's heart all over again. And when you do, I'll be there to document every moment of it. Victoria turned toward the elevator, pausing to deliver her final blow. Oh, and Lachlan, those photos will be in tomorrow's papers whether you cooperate or not. But if you want to control the narrative, if you want to protect your little family from the worst of it, you'll call me. Because I'm the only one who can make this story go away. The elevator doors closed on her satisfied smile, leaving Lachlan alone in the hallway with the taste of ash in his mouth and the sound of his children crying through the door. Everything Victoria had said was true. He had written those messages, had meant them when he sent them. The man who had told Victoria Ashworth that love was weakness was the same man now standing outside a flat where his family waited, broken and afraid. And for the first time since he'd seen Elowen on that airplane, Lachlan wondered if she might be better off without him after all. Lachlan stood outside the door for a full minute, listening to the chaos within, and trying to find the courage to face what he'd destroyed. The crying had intensified, both babies now wailing in the particular way that signaled complete overwhelm. Through the door, he could hear Elowen's voice. strained and desperate as she tried to soothe them. When he finally entered, the scene that greeted him was heartbreaking. Elowen sat on the floor of the living room, Kieran in her arms while Celeste lay on a blanket beside her, both children red-faced and inconsolable. Elowen herself looked close to tears, her hair disheveled and her hands shaking slightly as she rocked back and forth. "They can sense it," she said without looking up at him. "Children always know when something's wrong. They feel our stress, our fear, She swallowed hard. Our doubts. Lachlan knelt beside them, reaching for Celeste. His daughter turned toward him instinctively, her cries softening slightly at his touch, but her little body remained tense with anxiety. "Elowen, what Victoria said, was it true?" Her voice was steady, but when she finally looked at him, her green eyes held a pain that cut him to the bone. "Those messages she quoted, did you really say those things?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the baby's gradually quieting sobs. Lachlan could lie, could claim Victoria had fabricated everything, but he'd already caused enough damage with dishonesty. "Yes," he said quietly. "I said those things." Elowen closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. "When? 6 months ago, when I ended things with her. 6 months after I left you?" "Yes." Kieran had stopped crying and was now watching his parents with solemn gray eyes, as if he understood the gravity of the conversation happening around him. Celeste had settled against Lachlan's chest, her tiny fist gripping his shirt with surprising strength. "So you moved on that quickly?" Elowen said, her voice carefully neutral. "Found someone new, had a relationship with her." It wasn't like that." "What was it like then?" Lachlan struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "Victoria and I were business partners. The relationship was convenient, mutually beneficial. She understood that it wasn't emotional. Until she wanted more." "Until she wanted more," he confirmed. "And that's when you told her that love was weakness, that children were chaos you'd spent your life avoiding." Elowen's voice grew quieter with each word. "Did you mean it?" "I thought I did. You thought you did." She repeated the words as if testing their weight. "And now? Now that you've discovered you have children, that you've been forced into this situation, what do you think now?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Around them, the elegant flat seemed to mock the simple honesty of the moment. All this luxury couldn't buy him the right words to repair what had been broken. "I think," Lachlan said carefully, "that I was scared. I think I built my entire identity around control and success because those were the only things that felt safe. And I think when you left, when I realized what I'd lost, I became even more committed to that lie because the alternative was admitting I'd destroyed the best thing in my life." Elowen shifted Kieran to her other arm, the movement causing him to fuss slightly. "But you didn't come after me." "No, you didn't try to find me." "I did." The admission surprised them both. "I hired investigators. For 3 months I had teams looking for you, but you'd vanished completely. So you gave up. So I told myself it was for the best, that you were better off without me, that I'd only hurt you more if I tried to drag you back into my life. And then you found Victoria." The name fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples of pain and regret. Lachlan watched Elowen's face carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened, the way she unconsciously pulled Kieran closer. "Victoria was a mistake," he said finally. "A way of proving to myself that what we had was replaceable, that I could function without needing anyone. Did it work?" For a while, he paused, watching Celeste's peaceful face as she dozed against his chest. "Until it became clear that she wanted something real, and I realized I couldn't give her what I'd already given to someone else." Elowen's eyes snapped to his. "What do you mean?" "I mean that every night I spent with Victoria, I was thinking about you. Every conversation, every touch, every moment, I was comparing it to what we'd had and finding it wanting. She deserved better than that. You both did. So you ended it. I ended it. Badly. Cruelly. I told her all those things about love and children and emotional attachment because I was trying to convince myself as much as her. I was trying to build walls high enough that no one could get through them again." Kieran had fallen asleep in Elowen's arms, his tiny face peaceful despite the turmoil surrounding him. She looked down at their son with an expression of infinite tenderness before speaking. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she asked quietly. "When I found out I was pregnant, the first thing I felt wasn't fear or panic, it was joy. Pure, overwhelming joy because I was carrying your children, because some part of you would always be with me." Her words hit him like physical blows. And then reality set in, she continued. The reality of raising 2 babies alone. The reality of explaining to them someday why their father wasn't part of their lives. The reality of knowing that the man I'd fallen in love with had never really existed. Elowen. Had he, Lachlan? Because the man I married, the man I shared those nights with, was any of that real? Or was I just another convenient arrangement? Another way for you to maintain your image while keeping your heart safely locked away? The question stripped away every defense he'd ever built, every carefully constructed wall between his public persona and his private truth. In her eyes he saw not accusation but genuine confusion, as if she truly didn't know whether their entire relationship had been a performance. It was real, he said, his voice rough with emotion. God, Elowen, it was the most real thing in my life. Those nights, those moments when you would look at me like I was worth something, that was the only time I ever felt like myself. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the man everyone expected me to be. Just me. Then why did you let me go? Because I was terrified. The admission cost him everything. Because loving you meant risking everything I'd built, everything I thought I was. And I was too much of a coward to take that risk. Elowen was quiet for a long time, rocking Kieran gently while she processed his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I used to lie awake in that hospital when the babies were in the NICU, imagining what would happen if you walked through those doors. Would you take one look at these tiny, fragile little people and decide they were too much trouble? Would you offer me money to make the problem go away? Or would you— She paused, swallowing hard. Would you fall in love with them the way I had? What do you think now? I think you love them, she said simply. I can see it in the way you hold Celeste and the way you panic when Kieran cries. But Lachlan, loving them isn't enough. Children need consistency, stability, commitment. They need someone who won't disappear when things get difficult. I won't disappear. How can I believe that? How can I trust that this version of you, the devoted father, the man who wants to be part of their lives, isn't just another performance? Another role you're playing until it becomes inconvenient. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made his blood freeze. Thomas Blackwell, the most ruthless tabloid editor in London, and a man who had made millions destroying reputations. Elowen saw his expression change. What is it? The story's already starting, he said grimly, declining the call. Victoria wasn't bluffing. As if summoned by his words, his phone began buzzing incessantly. Calls from reporters, texts from his assistant, emails from his publicity team. Within hours, maybe minutes, their private crisis would become public entertainment. Elowen looked down at their sleeping children, her face pale with a new kind of fear. They're going to tear us apart, aren't they? The media, the publicity. They're going to turn our lives into a circus. I won't let that happen. How? How can you stop it? Lachlan looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms, at his son trusting completely in his mother's embrace, and felt something crystallize in his chest, a clarity he'd never experienced before, a certainty that cut through every doubt and fear. By telling the truth, he said, all of it, before Victoria can twist it into something ugly. Elowen stared at him in shock. You want to go public? Tell them about the contract marriage? About the divorce? About the children? I want to control the narrative before someone else does. I want to protect you and Kieran and Celeste from the worst of it. And what about your reputation? Your business, everything you've built? Lachlan met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw no calculation there, no strategic planning, just raw, honest emotion. None of it matters if I lose you again, he said. None of it matters if my children grow up thinking their father was ashamed of them. Outside, London traffic hummed through the windows, and somewhere in the city, Victoria Ashworth was probably watching the chaos she'd unleashed with satisfaction. But in the quiet of the nursery, surrounded by the evidence of their complicated love, Lachlan Pierce was finally ready to stop hiding from the truth. The press conference was set for the Langham Hotel's grand ballroom, neutral territory that would prevent the media circus from descending on their temporary home. In the 6 hours since Lachlan had made his decision, his publicity team had worked with military precision to arrange what they were calling a personal statement regarding recent speculation. But as Lachlan stood in the hotel's preparation room, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, he felt none of his usual pre-presentation confidence. This wasn't a business deal or a strategic announcement. This was his life, his family, his heart laid bare for public consumption. Elowen sat in the corner, Celeste sleeping peacefully in her arms while Kieran played quietly with blocks on the carpet. She'd been silent during most of the preparations, speaking only to coordinate childcare arrangements and to request that James bring her something appropriate to wear. The simple navy dress she'd chosen was elegant but understated, nothing that would draw attention away from what needed to be said. "The room is full," Margaret Chen, his head of public relations, announced as she entered. "All major UK outlets, several American networks, and about a dozen international correspondents. They're expecting blood in the water." "Then we won't disappoint them," Lachlan replied grimly. Margaret glanced nervously at Elowen and the children. "Sir, I have to ask one more time. Are you certain about this approach? We could issue a simple statement confirming the children's existence, provide minimal details, and let it die down naturally. This level of disclosure is necessary," Lachlan finished. "Victoria Ashworth has weaponized half-truths and speculation. The only way to disarm her is with complete transparency. And what about Ms. Hart? Have you considered what this exposure will mean for her and the children?" Elowen looked up from Celeste, her green eyes meeting Margaret's concerned gaze. "I've spent 15 months hiding," she said quietly, "from the world, from the truth, from the possibility that my children might never know their father. Maybe it's time to stop running." Kieran looked up at the sound of his mother's voice, offering her one of his blocks with a gummy smile that made Lachlan's heart contract. In a few minutes, that sweet, innocent face might be splashed across every newspaper in Europe. The thought made him physically ill. "Last chance to change your mind," he said to Elowen. "Is that what you want? For me to change my mind? I want you to feel safe. I want our children to be protected. They can't be protected from the truth forever, Lachlan. And maybe it's time for the world to see that even powerful men can be human." Margaret's phone buzzed. 5 minutes, she announced. "The podium is set up for 2 as requested. Are you both ready?" Lachlan nodded, but as they prepared to leave, Elowen caught his arm. "What if this backfires?" she asked quietly. "What if telling the truth just makes everything worse? Then we'll face it together," he replied, and meant it. The ballroom was a sea of camera flashes and expectant faces. Every major media outlet seemed to be represented, their reporters armed with notepads and knowing smirks. In the front row, Lachlan spotted Thomas Blackwell from the mirror, his expression hungry with anticipation. As they took their places at the podium, Lachlan at the microphone, Elowen slightly behind him, the room fell silent with predatory attention. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the unraveling of one of Britain's most private billionaires. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lachlan began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I've called this conference to address recent speculation about my personal life and to set the record straight about matters that have been misrepresented in the press." A hand shot up immediately, but Lachlan held up his own to forestall questions. "I'll take questions after I've made my statement. What I have to say requires context, and I ask for your patience as I provide it." He glanced back at Elowen, drawing strength from her steady presence, then turned back to face the wall of cameras and skeptical faces. 4 years ago, I made a business proposition to my executive assistant, Elowen Hart. I proposed a contract marriage, a legal arrangement that would benefit both of us professionally and financially, with clearly defined terms and a specific duration. The room erupted in murmurs and camera clicks. This wasn't what they'd expected. Most had assumed some sort of secret love affair or hidden scandal. "The arrangement was purely transactional," Lachlan continued, his voice growing stronger. "Ms. Hart needed financial security to handle family medical expenses and student debt. I needed the stability that marriage provided for my public image and business relationships. We agreed to 2 years, after which we would divorce amicably and go our separate ways. But that's not what happened," a reporter called out. "No," Lachlan agreed, "that's not what happened. Because somewhere between the contract signing and the expiration date, something unexpected occurred. I fell in love with my wife." The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the room. This wasn't the cold business story they'd come for. This was personal, raw, human. "The problem," Lachlan continued, "was that I was too afraid to admit it, too terrified of vulnerability to tell the woman I loved how I felt. So I maintained the fiction that our relationship was purely professional, even as we shared moments of genuine intimacy, even as I felt my world shifting around her presence in my life." He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. 3 weeks before our contract expired, Elowen asked for an immediate divorce. She left our marriage, left her job, and disappeared from my life completely. And I let her go because I was too much of a coward to fight for what mattered most. Why are you telling us this now? Thomas Blackwell called out. What's changed? Lachlan looked back at Elowen again, seeing the tears she was trying to hide, the way her hands trembled slightly as she listened to him lay their story bare. What's changed? He said, turning back to the room. Is that yesterday, I discovered that my ex-wife has been raising my children alone for the past 15 months.
Twin babies, a son and daughter, who were born after our divorce, who have spent their entire lives not knowing their father existed. The room exploded. Reporters leaped to their feet, shouting questions. Camera flashes going off like lightning. The revelation was bigger than anyone had anticipated. Ms. Hart, a voice called out over the chaos. Why didn't you tell him about the pregnancy? Elowen stepped forward to the microphone, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the noise.
Because, she said, I was afraid he would see them as another contract to manage, another problem to solve with money rather than love, and because I couldn't bear the thought of my children growing up feeling like obligations rather than blessings. Are you together now? Another reporter shouted. We're... Elowen glanced at Lachlan, uncertainty flickering across her features. We're learning how to be parents together, learning whether the love we shared was real enough to build a family on. Mr. Pierce? Thomas Blackwell stood, his voice carrying over the crowd. Sources suggest this reunion wasn't entirely voluntary, that you were forced into this situation by circumstance rather than choice. How do we know this isn't just another business arrangement? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, the chance to retreat into safe, sanitized responses or to risk everything on honesty. Lachlan looked out at the room full of skeptical faces, then back at Elowen, who was watching him with something like hope in her eyes. You want to know if this is real? He asked, stepping away from the podium to stand beside her. You want to know if my feelings for this woman and our children are genuine? He took Elowen's hand, feeling her fingers tremble in his. 4 days ago, I thought I had everything a man could want. Money, power, success, respect, I thought I was complete. But holding my daughter for the first time, watching my son smile, seeing the woman I love struggle alone with burdens I should have shared, I realized I've been living half a life. His voice grew stronger, more certain. I realized that all the money in the world can't buy you the sound of your child laughing. All the power in the world can't give you the peace of knowing you're exactly where you belong. And all the success in the world means nothing if you're too afraid to admit that you need someone more than they need you. He turned to face Elowen fully, no longer caring about the cameras or the reporters or the story this would become. I love you, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear but speaking only to her. I loved you when we were married. I loved you when you left. And I love you now. I love our children with a fierceness that terrifies me. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that this time, I'm brave enough to choose love over fear. The room had gone completely silent. Even the cameras had stopped clicking. In that moment, there was only Lachlan and Elowen and the truth hanging between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Tears were streaming down her face now, and her hand tightened in his. You terrible, wonderful man, she whispered, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. You couldn't have said that privately. I've spent too much of our relationship hiding in private, he replied. I wanted the whole world to know that Elowen Hart and our children are the most important thing in my life. The room erupted again, but neither of them was paying attention anymore. Because in the middle of a media circus, surrounded by strangers and cameras and the weight of public scrutiny, they had finally found their way back to each other. And this time, Lachlan wasn't going to let fear make him lose her again. The aftermath of the press conference hit like a tsunami. Within hours, their story dominated every news cycle from London to New York. Pierce family was trending globally, with reactions ranging from romantic admiration to cynical skepticism. But in the quiet sanctuary of the Knightsbridge flat, none of the outside noise mattered as much as the conversation that still needed to happen. Elowen sat on the nursery floor, watching Kieran and Celeste play with the expensive toys Mrs. Harrison had provided. Both children seemed blissfully unaware that their faces were now splashed across newspapers worldwide, their innocent smiles captured by telephoto lenses as they'd been carried from the hotel. Do you regret it? Lachlan asked from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. She looked up at him, this man who had just upended his entire carefully constructed life for her and their children. He'd changed out of his press conference suit into jeans and a simple gray sweater, but he still carried the tension of someone waiting for judgment. Which part? She asked. The press conference? The truth? Or falling in love with you in the first place? Any of it. All of it. Elowen considered the question while Celeste crawled over to her, pulling herself up on unsteady legs to demand attention. Their daughter had been particularly clingy since the chaos began, as if sensing the emotional upheaval around her. I regret that it took this long, she said finally. I regret that we wasted 2 years being afraid of what we felt. I regret that our children's first public appearance was at a press conference, instead of at a park or a playground like normal families. But I don't regret the truth, and I don't regret loving you, even when it nearly destroyed me. Lachlan stepped into the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside them with an unconscious grace that would have surprised his business associates. Kieran immediately crawled toward him, fascinated by this person who was becoming less of a stranger with each passing hour. There's something else we need to discuss, Lachlan said, lifting Kieran onto his lap. Victoria called an hour ago. Elowen's body tensed. What did she want? To congratulate me on my performance, as she put it. She seemed to think the press conference was just another strategic move. And what did you tell her? That she'd lost? That her threats were meaningless now that the truth was public? Elowen studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned Victoria's name. But that's not all, is it? Lachlan was quiet for a moment, bouncing Kieran gently while he found his words. She made it clear that this isn't over, that she has other ways to hurt us, hurt the children. She mentioned custody challenges, investigative journalists, ways to make our lives hell that don't require tabloid headlines. Fear flickered across Elowen's features. She can't take them away from us. No, she can't. But she can make fighting to keep them expensive and traumatic. She can drag our private lives through court proceedings, force invasive investigations into our fitness as parents. Celeste began to fuss, and Elowen automatically lifted her, using the familiar routine of maternal comfort to steady herself. What are you saying? I'm saying that being with me puts you and the children at risk, that loving me comes with consequences you shouldn't have to face. The words hung between them like a test, and Elowen felt the familiar fear creep up her spine, the fear that he was looking for an exit, a reason to retreat back into his carefully controlled world. So what do you want to do? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. I want to marry you, he said simply. The words hit her like a physical shock. What? I want to marry you. For real this time. Not a contract, not an arrangement, not a strategic alliance. I want to marry you because I love you and I want our children to grow up in a home where their parents choose each other every day. Elowen stared at him, searching his face for any hint of calculation or strategy, but all she saw was raw honesty and something that looked suspiciously like hope. Lachlan, I know it's crazy. I know we have 1,000 things to work through, and I know I have no right to ask for another chance after everything I've put you through. But Elowen, I can't lose you again. I won't survive it this time. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang with sharp insistence. They both froze, remembering the media circus outside, but James's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Pierce, there's a Dr. Sarah Chen here to see Ms. Hart. She says it's regarding the children's medical records. Elowen went pale. She's not supposed to be here for another 2 days. Who is she? Lachlan asked. The pediatrician who's been treating Kieran and Celeste in Portland. She was supposed to forward their medical files to a London practice, but she said she wanted to examine them one more time before the transition. Something cold settled in Lachlan's stomach. You didn't arrange for her to come here? No, and she doesn't have this address. They looked at each other with growing alarm. James's voice came through the intercom again. Sir, should I send her up? No, Lachlan said sharply. James, ask to see her identification, and call building security. Of course, sir. Elowen was already moving, gathering the babies with quick efficiency. Something's wrong. Dr. Chen would never show up unannounced, and she certainly wouldn't have our address. Lachlan's phone buzzed with a text message. When he read it, his blood turned to ice. You should have taken my offer when you had the chance. Some secrets are bigger than love stories. Be Victoria, he said grimly, showing Elowen the message. What secrets? What is she talking about? Before he could answer, James's voice crackled through the intercom again, but this time with urgency. Mr. Pierce, the woman downstairs isn't Dr. Chen. She's a private investigator named Miranda Davies. She claims to have information about Ms. Hart that you need to see immediately. Elowen's face went white. Miranda Davies, she whispered. You know her? She's the investigator who helped me disappear after our divorce. The one who created my new identity, helped me stay hidden. Elowen's voice shook. If she's here, it means someone with serious resources has been looking for me. Victoria. But why now? What could she possibly hope to gain? Lachlan's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Victoria was brilliant, vindictive, and patient. If she'd hired the same investigator who had helped Elowen vanish, it could only mean she'd uncovered something devastating. His phone rang. Victoria's name on the screen made his jaw clench, but he answered. "What do you want?" "To make you an offer." Victoria's voice was silk over steel. "One last chance to save your little family from complete destruction. I'm listening. Meet me. Tonight. Alone. The Shard observation deck. 10 p.m. Come alone, or I promise you that by tomorrow morning, Elowen Hart will be facing charges that will destroy her life and take those children away from both of you forever." The line went dead. Elowen had heard enough to understand the threat. "What charges, Lachlan? What is she talking about?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He stood, his face set with grim determination. "Call Margaret. Tell her to get our lawyers here immediately. Call Mrs. Harrison and ask her to arrange security for the building." "Where are you going?" "To end this." "Not alone." Elowen stood as well, still holding Celeste. "Whatever Victoria thinks she knows, whatever she's planning, we face it together. Elowen, if she's right, if there are charges, then we'll fight them. Together. But I'm not letting you walk into whatever trap she's set without backup. The children, James and Mrs. Harrison, can watch them for a few hours. They'll be safer here than anywhere else." Lachlan looked at his family, at Kieran reaching for him with complete trust, at Celeste content in her mother's arms, at Elowen standing ready to fight beside him despite every reason to run. "You could leave," he said quietly. "Take the children and disappear again. Miranda Davies could help you, keep you safe from whatever Victoria has planned. Is that what you want? I want you to be safe. I want our children to be protected. Then stop trying to face this alone." Elowen's voice carried the steel he remembered from their business days, the strength that had first drawn him to her. "We're stronger together, Lachlan. Isn't that what today taught us?" Outside, London glittered in the approaching darkness, full of secrets and shadows and the promise of confrontation. But inside the nursery, surrounded by evidence of their love and their hope for the future, Lachlan and Elowen prepared to face whatever storm Victoria Ashworth had brewing. Because this time, they wouldn't let fear tear them apart. This time, they would choose each other, no matter what the cost. The Shard pierced the London sky like a glass dagger, its observation deck offering a panoramic view of the city sprawling below. At 10 p.m., the tourist crowds had long departed, leaving the space eerily quiet except for the whisper of wind against reinforced glass. Victoria Ashworth stood silhouetted against the glittering cityscape, her platinum hair catching the ambient light as she waited with predatory patience. Lachlan and Elowen emerged from the elevator together, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. They'd left the children with James and Mrs. Harrison, surrounded by security that would make Fort Knox envious. But no amount of protection could shield them from whatever truth Victoria was about to unleash. "I told you to come alone," Victoria said without turning around. "And I told you that we're done playing by your rules," Lachlan replied, his voice carrying across the observation deck. Victoria finally turned, and in the ambient lighting, her beauty was sharp as winter, all elegant angles and calculated perfection. But her eyes held a darkness that spoke of obsession and barely controlled rage. How touching. The devoted couple, ready to face anything together. Her smile was razor sharp. "I wonder if that unity will survive what I'm about to tell you." "Just say what you came to say," Elowen said, her voice steady despite the fear Lachlan could feel radiating from her. "Oh, I will. But first, let me set the stage." Victoria moved to one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, gesturing at the city below. "Do you see that building there? The one with the red lights? That's the Children's Protection Service's headquarters. They work very closely with international law enforcement when cases involve child endangerment." Lachlan's jaw clenched. "If you've contacted social services with false allegations..." "False?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, Lachlan, you still don't understand. The allegations aren't false. They're just complicated." She pulled out a tablet, swiping to reveal documents that made Elowen's face go ashen with recognition. "Tell me, Elowen, do you remember Dr. Marcus Whitfield?" The name hit Elowen like a physical blow. Lachlan watched her sway slightly, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the glass. "I can see that you do," Victoria continued with satisfaction. Dr. Whitfield was the attending physician when your twins were born prematurely in Portland. Very dedicated doctor. Very thorough in his record-keeping. What are you talking about? Lachlan demanded, moving protectively closer to Elowen. I'm talking about medical fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment charges that could send your beloved Elowen to prison for 10 years. Victoria's voice carried the satisfaction of someone holding all the cards. You see, when our dear Elowen disappeared after your divorce, she didn't just change her name. She assumed a completely false identity. Elowen's breathing had become shallow, but she forced herself to speak. I had to protect myself and the babies. Protect yourself by using a dead woman's social security number, by forging medical histories and birth certificates. Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. The identity you've been living under belongs to one Elowen Hart, who died in a car accident in Nevada 3 years ago. A very convenient death for someone who needed to disappear. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Lachlan looked at Elowen, seeing not guilt but the exhausted resignation of someone whose deepest secret had finally been exposed. Is it true? He asked quietly. Elowen closed her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. You see, Lachlan, Victoria continued, circling them like a shark scenting blood. Your precious Elowen isn't just the wronged wife seeking to protect her children. She's a fugitive who's been living under a stolen identity, who gave birth to those babies using fraudulent documents, who's been claiming medical benefits and government assistance under false pretenses. Why? Lachlan asked, his voice rough with confusion and pain. Elowen opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a mixture of love and desperation. Because I couldn't use my real name. Because if I'd filed for divorce as Elena Morrison instead of Elowen Hart, you would have found me in a day. The words hit him like lightning. Elena Morrison. My real name. The name on my birth certificate. My Stanford transcripts. My original employment records. Tears were streaming down her face now. The name that would have led you straight to my mother's medical files, to the debt collectors, to everything I was trying to escape. Victoria moved closer, sensing the kill. Elena Morrison, who embezzled $200,000 from her previous employer before coming to work for you, Lachlan, who used that stolen money to pay for her mother's experimental cancer treatments, who's been running from federal fraud charges for 5 years. That's not... Elowen started to protest, but Victoria cut her off. Isn't it? The money went missing from Hartwell and Associates the same week you left that job. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I didn't steal anything, Elowen said, her voice gaining strength. I borrowed it. I was going to pay it back. With what money? You were drowning in debt. Your mother was dying, and you had no way to repay what you'd taken. So you ran, changed your name, forged your credentials, and convinced Lachlan Pierce to marry you under false pretenses. Lachlan felt the foundation of everything he thought he knew crumbling beneath his feet. Elena, he said softly, testing the unfamiliar name. It doesn't matter what my name is, she said fiercely. It doesn't change who I am, or what we've been to each other, or what our children mean to us. Doesn't it? Victoria's voice carried false sympathy. Because I have to wonder, Lachlan, how much of the woman you fell in love with was real? How much was just another carefully constructed lie? Stop. The word came out harder than Lachlan had intended. Just stop. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I said stop. Lachlan moved to stand beside Elowen, taking her hand in his. You want to know how much of her was real? All of it. Every moment, every conversation, every night we spent together, that was real. Even though she lied to you about everything? Her name, her past, her very identity? Especially because she lied to me. Lachlan's voice grew stronger, more certain. Do you know what it takes to reinvent yourself completely? To build a new life from nothing, with no support, no safety net, no one to turn to? It takes courage I can't even imagine. He turned to face Elowen fully, his gray eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who was brave enough to sacrifice everything to save her mother. I see someone who was strong enough to start over with nothing when staying would have been easier. I see the mother of my children, who protected them from a world that would have torn them apart. Lachlan, Elowen whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I see the woman I fell in love with, whether her name is Elowen or Elena or anything else, because your name isn't what makes you who you are. Your heart is, your courage is, your capacity to love despite everything you've been through. That's what makes you extraordinary. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. How touching. But love doesn't erase criminal charges, Lachlan. Love doesn't make fraud disappear. No, Lachlan agreed, but money does. Influence does. And I have both. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number Victoria recognized with growing alarm. Michael, it's Lachlan Pierce. I need you to wire transfer $500,000 to Hartwell and Associates immediately. Yes, tonight. With a letter stating that the funds represent repayment plus interest for a loan made to Elena Morrison 5 years ago. Full documentation, retroactive paperwork, whatever it takes to make this legal and binding. Victoria stepped forward, her mask finally slipping to reveal naked fury. You can't what? Pay back money that should have been repaid years ago? Hire the best lawyers in London to ensure my wife's safety? Use every resource at my disposal to protect my family? Lachlan's smile was sharp as a blade. Watch me. He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Margaret, I need you to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. I'm prepared to make a full settlement for any outstanding charges against Elena Morrison, with the understanding that all charges will be dropped upon repayment. Yes, I know what time it is. Make it happen. Victoria was backing away now, realizing that her carefully laid trap was closing around her instead of its intended targets. This won't work, she said desperately. The identity fraud, the false documents, will be handled by the immigration lawyers I'm hiring tomorrow morning, Lachlan said calmly. Elena Morrison will resume her legal identity, with full documentation and government cooperation. The transition will be seamless. The children's birth certificates will be amended to reflect their mother's correct legal name. All medical records will be updated accordingly. Everything will be legitimate. Victoria stared at him in shock. You're willing to do all of this? Risk everything you've built, spend millions in legal fees, possibly face charges yourself for aiding a fugitive? Lachlan looked at Elowen, at Elena, and felt the last piece of his old life fall away. I'm willing to do anything for my family, he said simply, because that's what love means. Not just the easy parts, not just when it's convenient. All of it. The messy, complicated, frightening parts too. He turned to Victoria one final time. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to delete every photo, every document, every piece of information you have about my wife and children. You're going to disappear from our lives completely. And if you ever threaten my family again, you'll discover exactly how ruthless I can be when someone I love is in danger. Victoria's face was white with rage and defeat. This isn't over. Yes, Lachlan said quietly. It is. As Victoria stalked toward the elevators, her heels clicking angrily against the floor, Elowen turned to face the man she loved. Elena Morrison, he said softly, testing the name again. Are you angry? I'm proud, he said, cupping her face in his hands. I'm proud of your strength, your sacrifice, your courage. I'm proud that you trusted me enough to let me fight for you. I love you, she whispered. Whatever name I use, whoever I am or was, I love you. I love you too, Elena Morrison. Elowen Hart. Mrs. Pierce, if you'll have me. He smiled, and for the first time in weeks it reached his eyes. I love all of you. Every part, every secret, every beautiful, complicated piece of who you are. Below them, London glittered like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in the city their children were sleeping safely, protected by love and money, and the promise of a future built on truth instead of fear. And high above it all, in a tower of glass and steel, a man who had spent his life avoiding risk finally understood that the greatest risk of all was not loving completely. 2 years later, the morning sun filtered through the tall windows of their Cotswolds home, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors where toy trains and picture books lay scattered in comfortable chaos. Elena Pierce, she'd legally reclaimed her birth name after marrying Lachlan for the second time, sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, watching their 3-year-old twins navigate the complex social dynamics of sharing. Mine, Celeste declared, clutching a stuffed elephant to her chest with the fierce possessiveness that only toddlers could manage. Share, Cece, Kieran said with the patient wisdom of someone exactly 3 minutes older than his sister. He offered her one of his toy cars in exchange, and after a moment of serious consideration, Celeste accepted the trade. Good negotiating, Lachlan observed from the doorway, balancing a tray of coffee and toast. At 41, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had finally learned to prioritize what truly mattered. His sandy hair was slightly longer now, often tousled by small hands, and his eyes held a warmth that had been absent during his corporate days. They get it from you, Elena replied, accepting her coffee with a grateful smile. Yesterday, Kieran convinced Mrs. Chen to give him an extra biscuit by offering to help reorganize her bookshelf. Brilliant boy, though I think he gets his charm from you. Elena laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way it never had been during their first marriage. We both know charm isn't my strong suit. I'm more of the stubborn determination until you wear everyone down type. That's not charm? Lachlan settled beside her on the floor, immediately becoming a human climbing structure as both children abandoned their toys in favor of their father. Because it worked on me. The house around them bore little resemblance to either of their previous homes. The Knightsbridge flat had been sold, along with most of Lachlan's unnecessary properties. This Georgian manor house in the Cotswolds was smaller than his former penthouse but infinitely warmer, filled with family photos, children's artwork, and the comfortable clutter of people who actually lived in their space. Elena had kept her promise to work in publishing, though now she ran her own small press from the converted stable block, specializing in debut literary fiction. It was work that fed her soul in ways that corporate efficiency never had, and Lachlan had scaled back his business empire to focus on sustainable infrastructure projects that made a difference rather than just generating profit. "Daddy playground?" Celeste asked, tugging on his sleeve with the persistence of someone who knew her requests were rarely denied. "After breakfast," he promised, which earned him a delighted squeal and an enthusiastic hug that nearly knocked him backward. "She has you completely wrapped around her finger," Elena observed with fond exasperation. "They both do, and so do you." He caught her hand, running his thumb over the simple platinum band that had replaced the elaborate diamond from their contract marriage. "No complaints here." Elena studied their joined hands, still sometimes amazed by how different this felt from their first attempt at marriage. Then, every touch had been tentative, loaded with unspoken rules and careful boundaries. Now their physical connection was as natural as breathing, hands that sought each other automatically, casual kisses, the easy intimacy of people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The old life, the power, the control, the simplicity of only having to worry about yourself?" Lachlan considered the question while Kieran climbed onto his shoulders and Celeste settled into his lap, both children taking his attention for granted in the way that only beloved children could. "I miss the 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep," he said finally, earning a laugh from Elena. "And I miss being able to have adult conversations without someone asking for juice boxes in the middle of important sentences." "Juice!" Celeste announced as if summoned by his words. "See?" He dropped a kiss on her dark hair, so like his own, before continuing. "But miss the isolation, the fear of vulnerability, the emptiness of measuring my worth by profit margins?" He shook his head. "Never. Even when Kieran had that fever last month and we spent 3 days in the hospital convinced he was seriously ill. Especially then, because that was the moment I realized that all the money in the world is worthless if you don't have people to worry about." He shifted Celeste more comfortably, noting the way she immediately snuggled closer. "The terror I felt when he was sick was proof that I'm finally alive in ways I never was before." Elena's eyes softened with understanding. She'd watched him transform over the past 2 years, had seen him learn to father their children with a tenderness that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. He read bedtime stories with elaborate character voices, pushed them on swings until his arms ached, and had once spent an entire weekend building an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, just because Celeste had mentioned wanting a castle. "Mrs. Chen called yesterday," Elena said, settling back against the sofa with her coffee. "She wants to know if we'll bring the children to visit Portland this summer." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd talk to you. Portland holds complicated memories." Lachlan nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. The small apartment where she'd struggled alone, the NICU where their premature babies had fought for life while he remained oblivious to their existence, the bookstore where she'd worked for minimum wage while raising twins. It was a chapter of their story that still carried pain despite its ultimate resolution. "We should go," he said finally. "The children should see where they were born. Meet the people who helped you when I couldn't. Mrs. Chen was your family when you needed one most. It won't be easy. The important things never are." He met her eyes over Kieran's head. "But we're stronger now, and I want our children to understand their whole story, not just the fairy tale ending." Kieran had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder, exhausted by the morning's excitement. Celeste was fighting sleep, but losing, her eyelids drooping despite her determined attempts to stay awake. "Nap time," Elena observed. 5 more minutes, Lachlan said, reluctant to disturb the peaceful moment. I have a conference call with the Singapore team later, but right now, this is exactly where I want to be. Elena studied his face, noting the complete absence of the restless energy that had once driven him from meeting to meeting, deal to deal. Success now meant something entirely different, measured in bedtime stories read, scraped knees kissed, family dinners shared around a table that bore the marks of art projects and homework sessions. Do you think they'll understand someday? She asked. When they're older, when they learn about the contract marriage and the scandal and everything we went through to get here, I think they'll understand that love isn't perfect or simple or easy. I think they'll understand that sometimes the best things in life come from the most complicated beginnings. He shifted to look at her directly. And I think they'll be proud that their parents fought for each other instead of giving up when things got difficult. Even when I lied about my identity for 2 years. Especially then, because you did what you had to do to survive, to protect them, to build a life for our family. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. The legal resolution of Elena's past had taken 18 months and more money than most people saw in a lifetime. But it was finally, completely behind them. Elena Morrison Pierce was now her legal name, with documentation that satisfied both American and British authorities. The children's birth certificates bore the correct information, their medical records were seamless, and the shadow of Victoria Ashworth's threats had been relegated to an unpleasant memory. Victoria herself had disappeared from their lives as completely as she'd entered them, though Lachlan occasionally received updates from his security team about her whereabouts. She'd started a new company in Hong Kong, seemingly focused on legitimate business ventures rather than personal vendettas. He hoped for everyone's sake that she'd found whatever peace had been driving her destructive behavior. "Juice, Mama," Celeste mumbled sleepily, her request more automatic than urgent. "After your nap, sweetheart," Elena said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "Promise?" "Promise." The simple exchange, the kind of ordinary moment that filled their days now, reminded Lachlan of how profoundly his definition of success had shifted. 2 years ago, promises were contracts, negotiations, strategic advantages. Now they were sacred commitments to small people who trusted him completely. His phone buzzed with a text from James, who had followed them to the Cotswolds and now managed their much simplified household with the same dedication he'd once applied to Lachlan's corporate schedule. Singapore team requesting to move call earlier. "Shall I reschedule for after nap time?" Lachlan typed back quickly. "Yes. Family time is non-negotiable." Elena noticed the exchange and smiled. "Remember when you used to take calls during dinner? I remember when I used to think business calls were more important than family dinner. Different person, different priorities. Better person," she corrected gently. "Person who finally learned what actually matters." Both children were fully asleep now, Kieran snoring softly against his father's shoulder while Celeste had curled into a perfect ball in Lachlan's lap. The morning sun had shifted, painting new patterns across the floor, and somewhere in the kitchen, their housekeeper was quietly preparing lunch. "We should put them down in their beds," Elena said, though she made no move to get up. "We should," Lachlan agreed, also staying perfectly still. They sat in comfortable silence, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. Outside, the Cotswolds countryside stretched in rolling green hills dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls. It was peaceful in a way that Lachlan's former life had never been, quiet enough to hear birds singing and wind moving through trees instead of traffic and construction and the constant hum of urban ambition. "I love you," Elena said suddenly, the words emerging without preamble or explanation. "I love you too," he replied immediately. "All of you. Forever. Even when I'm stubborn and overthink everything and insist on reading the children educational books instead of just fun stories. Especially when you do all of those things. Though I notice you've started adding more picture books to the rotation. They wear me down. Between you and the twins, I'm completely outnumbered by people who think bedtime stories should be entertainment rather than learning opportunities. Good thing you love us anyway. Best thing," she corrected. Later, after the children were settled in their beds and Lachlan had finished his conference call, they would walk through the village to pick up groceries, stopping to chat with neighbors who knew them simply as the Pierce family, rather than as tabloid headlines or business titans. They would prepare dinner together while the twins helped by sorting vegetables and stealing tastes of everything within reach. After bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, they would sit in their garden with glasses of wine, planning Kieran's upcoming birthday party, and discussing Elena's latest manuscript submission. They would make love with the unhurried passion of people who had all the time in the world, and they would fall asleep with her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. It was an ordinary life, the kind that millions of people lived without fanfare or recognition. But for two people who had nearly lost each other to fear and pride and the weight of their own complicated histories, it was extraordinary in its simple perfection. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, noting the distant look in his eyes. "Just this. All of it. How different everything is from what I thought I wanted. Better or worse? Immeasurably better. So much better that I can't even remember who I was before you. Before them." He gestured toward the stairs where their children slept. "Sometimes I look back at my old life and it feels like it belonged to someone else entirely." It did, in a way. "We're both different people now. Better people. Happier people," she corrected. "More honest. More brave. More tired," he added with a laugh which earned him a gentle elbow to the ribs. "Worth it, though. Every sleepless night, every temper tantrum, every moment of chaos. Completely worth it." Elena curled closer to him on the sofa, fitting against his side with the ease of long practice. Outside, the afternoon was growing warm, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. It was peaceful and perfect, and exactly the life neither of them had known they wanted. "No regrets?" she asked, the question that had become their private ritual. "Only one," Lachlan replied, his standard response. "Which is? That it took us so long to get here." Elena smiled, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "We got here when we were ready. When we were brave enough to choose love over fear. When we learned that the greatest risk isn't loving someone, it's not loving them enough." They sat together in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the evidence of their love and their courage, and their commitment to choosing each other every day. Their children slept peacefully upstairs, secure in the knowledge that they were wanted and cherished. Their future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details but absolutely certain in its foundation. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that movies promised, with perfect people making perfect choices. It was something better, the real-life ending that came from flawed people choosing to fight for each other, to grow together, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. And in a world that often seemed to reward cynicism over hope, their love stood as proof that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the brave choice was also the right choice. Sometimes, love really was enough. Would you have made the same choice when faced with the decision between safety and love? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.